welcome, all of you. It's a big honor for us to have Ross Jackson here in the studio. For me, he's one of the really great heroes in the world. I read his book last summer and it was just mind-blowing. It was such a clear vision how we could get out on the other side through this crisis. So I'm very honored to have you here, Ross, and I hope that you will have a really, really good evening. This presentation will be in English. There are some folks in here who only understand English, and we would like to spread this presentation to a wider public. So welcome, give Ross a big hand.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to talk about the big picture. Global problems, global solutions. Mostly based on my book, Occupy World Street. Although I will have a few words to say later on about the situation here in Denmark. But first I'd like to just say a few words about my background. Let's see, which of these is the one?
This is the one.
Yeah. Right. So my approach. See, I have sort of two different hats on. In my background, I've worked about half of my life in the business world, particularly in the financial world, and the other half of my life working in the NGO world. So when I look at these problems, I'm seeing them from two different perspectives. One is from the bottom, from below, and the other is from above, from the point of view of the nation states. And when we talk about from below, some of the projects which I've been involved in for over 20 years are mentioned here. The Global Eco-Village Network, or GEN, as some of you may have heard of. This is a global network of small, sustainable communities, intentional communities, and also traditional villages, actually, in the south. And we've developed a global network for linking these people together so that they feel that they're part of a single movement trying to create models for how we can live sustainably and actually committing themselves to doing this. So one reason we've supported them from the beginning in my foundation called Gaia Trust is because they are actually walking their talk. They're making personal commitment to try to live in a sustainable way. And they represent, in my opinion, models for the future, showing how we all are going to have to live eventually. The other major project we've had in Gaia Trust is called Gaia Education. And this is an educational program which has two different ways of being presented. One is a 4-week course which is held across the world. We've held it in 35 different countries and many eco-villages and other educational institutions. And now we also have an online version. We're teaching now both in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and we intend to expand our activities into other languages. And this is a program which is more or less an introduction to how to design sustainable communities based on 4 different dimensions, looking at the ecological, the economic, the social, and what we call the worldview, or the spiritual, cultural aspect. And a holistic approach then to thinking, which can be used by people in all walks of life to make them think more in terms of the whole and not just in sectors. If we look at the other aspect of my other hat from above, I've worked for about 25 years in the financial world, advising large international banks and pension funds and so forth on investment strategies, and in particular, in the latter part of my career, I was specializing in the currency markets, where I developed one of the first hedge funds for managing currencies. But this was all done with one purpose in mind: to earn money for the foundation, the Gaia Trust, in order to support the bottom-up activities. So, I like to. I'd like to show this next diagram because I'm sure you've all heard of the Occupy movement. And this chart here shows very clearly what the Occupy movement was all about. We'll see here 2 different tables. The table at the top shows the growth in income in the United States over the period from 1950 to 1978, and how the gains were distributed among these five different groups of 20% fractiles. And notice how the income increases were fairly evenly distributed in this period. In fact, it was the lowest 20% who had the greatest percentage increase. Now compare that with the lower diagram, which shows a similar development from the period of 1979 to 2005. A dramatic difference. Here we see that it was the lowest 20% had the least income increase, only 1%, while the top 1% had an increase of over 200%. The top 0.1%, 390%. So what we saw happening here was a very dramatic shift from about 1980 onwards in the income distribution in the United States. And this is the whole background for the Occupy movement. We were pointing out that this was completely unacceptable to have this kind of income skewness. And because we know from history that when income differences become so large, it usually leads to some form of revolution or war. Historically, it has almost always done that. In fact, the current distribution of the difference between the rich and poor recently around the crisis of 2008 was the greatest it's been since before the major crash of 1929. And so there are some similarities. So what I'm going to do now is very briefly run through some of the consequences of this shift which happened around 1980 and show you that what we've seen happening globally is actually quite catastrophic in three different areas. I'll look at the social, the economic, and the environmental aspects. If we take the social aspects first, this curve shows the so-called Gini coefficient, an average for all nations, which is a measure of inequality. The larger the Gini coefficient is, the more unequal the distribution of income. And we see that it was fairly flat up to about the midpoint, which is around 1980, and then it began to climb very dramatically. Now this is very interesting. It's not just a moral question. This diagram here indicates some of the consequences of having large disparities in income. This is a diagram taken from a book called The Spirit Level by two English researchers who looked at the industrialized countries and made a comparison between the level of inequality, which is measured on the horizontal axis by the Gini coefficient, and in the vertical axis they measured what they called an index of health problems. Well, they had a number of components, both physical and mental health. And they wanted to see if there was any correlation, any relationship between health problems and inequality. And we found there was a very, very clear relationship. The countries with the greatest inequality, and the USA stands out here very clearly, had the absolutely worst score on health, on all of these different measures. And if we look at the opposite end of this table, we see countries like the Scandinavian countries and Japan, who apparently have the best result in terms of good health and a relatively low level of inequality. So the message from these researchers was that inequality has consequences. And one of the consequences is that inequality creates stress and sickness. I think most of it is psychosomatic. It's actually based on the feeling that somebody else is running a little faster. In English, we say that keeping up with the Joneses. You know, everybody feels that no matter how much income you may have, somebody else, your neighbor, may be earning a little more, and so you feel insecure, and so you have to run even faster. And it's this relative feeling that creates the stress and creates sickness, which is physically measurable. So inequality really has consequences. Now, the next area I'm going to talk about briefly is the environment. Now, here again, this is a diagram which shows a curve which we call the ecological footprint of humanity. This is a measure of the number of hectares per person required to keep up the standard of living that we have acquired. And if we go back about 50 years or so, we go back to the beginning of this curve in 1960, globally speaking, we were using up roughly 50% of the global capacity what nature can provide each year in terms of renewable resources. We went through the point here around 1990, which we call the world biocapacity. This is the point when we started using 100% of what's available each year. And today we're up around 150%, which means we have an overshoot. We're actually every year using about 50% more than the ecosystem can provide. And how is that possible, you might ask? Well, the major contributor to that overshoot is the waste depots. Our waste, which is primarily carbon dioxide, is being deposited in the oceans and in the atmosphere. And it's having the consequences in the ocean of making the ocean more acidic, making it slightly warmer, and this is having catastrophic effects on marine life, particularly, for example, on the coral reefs, which are dying all over the world. And they are at the bottom of the food chain. So, I mean, what happens in the oceans is really important for our everyday food supply. So this is, again, an example of, the disastrous effects of this period, particularly this last 30 years. And finally, I'm going to look at the economic costs for this period. Once again, we see a very dramatic shift. This curve shows two curves. The one at the top is the American gross national product, which was pretty much steadily increasing during this period. The lower curve is called the genuine progress indicator, which you see is much flatter. And the difference is that many economists have pointed out that the gross national product doesn't really measure our well-being, even though that's the way it's usually used. When economists and journalists and politicians talk about we're going to grow by 1% next year or 2% next year, they're talking about the upper part of this curve. They're talking about the total level of activity. But that activity can include both negative and positive factors. For example, if we have to spend a lot of money cleaning up pollution, as we're doing now, for example, all over Denmark, a lot of these places in Western Jutland, for example, have been contaminated by chemical companies 50 years ago, and it's costing us hundreds of millions of kroner to clean up, and it's going to take us 50 years. These are some of the costs that contribute to the total activity, but are negative. So similarly, if we have more traffic accidents, if we have more sickness in society, more hospital days for the entire society, all of this is contributing to the gross national product, but in a negative way. And so if we deduct the negative from the positive, what we find is we're actually no better off than we were 50 years ago, or at least 30 years ago. And this diagram is not only for the United States. This one is the American picture, but we have similar patterns in other countries, including the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland. And all of these countries show the same pattern. Something dramatically has been happening. And finally, if that wasn't problem enough with these three different areas where things have gone badly, then we have this whole question of peak oil, which is lurking in the future. If we look at this geologically speaking, across a period of several centuries, we can say that right now we're sitting right on top of a very sharp peak. There's enough oil in the ground, you might say, to keep industrial production running for about 250 years, and we're about halfway through that now. And at some point, the availability of cheap fossil fuels, oil and gas, is going to go into decline. And many geological experts predicted 10 years ago that this would happen around 2010 to 2012. It actually didn't happen yet. Although, we've moved us just slightly. What has happened is that because of the so-called shale gas fracking, which started in the United States, and it's beginning to come into Europe now, that has probably pushed out the period when the decline will set in by a few years. We don't know how many. My guess would be sometime in the 2020s, maybe 15 years from now. At some point, we're going to go into decline, and when that happens, the major effect is it's not that we're going to run out of oil. Half of the oil is still left, but it's going to mean that we're going to have an economic, almost a permanent or many decade downturn in economic growth, because has been shown that the major factor affecting economic growth for the last century has been using more and more energy all the time. And that energy has been coming from fossil fuels. So a kind of a bleak picture of the future. And of course, on top of that, we have the problem of climate change. And we know that if all the current oil is burned up in the next 50 years, well, the temperatures are likely to go up to 5-6 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that could mean, in worst case, it could mean that the end of our species on this planet, in the worst case. So what happened in 1980? What happened that suddenly that created these major shifts in these three areas? The economic, which was basically no better off than we were before. The ecological, with a disastrous environmental development, and the social, with the inequality. Well, I'm claiming that the major thing that happened was the introduction of neoliberal economics. This is a new philosophy that was brought into play by President Reagan in the United States and Prime Minister Thatcher in the UK primarily. And their philosophy was very much to give the business world the freedom to do what they wanted. And the philosophy was based on the idea that what's good for the business world is good for everyone. And it will lift, all ships will rise with the tide, was the expression. And so this philosophy says we should have free flow of goods across borders, we should have the free flow of capital, we should deregulate the corporations, and we should privatize as much as possible inefficient public monopolies. And it is this combination, which I believe has created the problem, because what has happened is we have concentrated wealth more and more in the hands of fewer and fewer very, very wealthy individuals and corporations, and taking more and more wealth away from the middle class and the lower classes. Some of the other consequences of this development, I would say one of them is what I would call unfair competition. What we have, if you take Denmark for an example here, today, our Danish companies have to compete with these large multinationals, many of whom are larger than Denmark, and they are operating often with sweatshops in Asia, where they can produce at very low labor costs and also under conditions which we would never accept in Denmark. They are able to ignore the environmental effects of their activity, their production. In fact, the way to make the most money these days is to pass on as many of your real costs to the taxpayers in the various countries where you're operating. And even also regarding to tax, many of them don't pay much tax because they base their activities in tax havens. They use transfer pricing and fictitious interest rates to reduce the amount of tax they pay in countries like Denmark. Now, how can a Danish company who doesn't have these same advantages ever compete in price with such foreign competitors? And the answer is, well, we can't. And this is why we see more and more companies moving out of Denmark, or outsourcing their production to China, or simply going bankrupt. This is the situation which our finance minister Corydon calls the competitive society. But it is a competition we can never win, and it's going to destroy our welfare system if it goes on for much longer. It's happening all over Europe now, and it's happening everywhere. There are such concentrations of capital now internationally that individual countries really have no chance of competing against these mastodons, these large corporations. And then we have the problem also that one of the results of this is very, very little action on climate, because the people who are making all the money have really no interest in accepting restrictions at all. And in fact, in the United States, the large companies have paid millions and millions of dollars to convince the public that climate change is not created by man's activities, but it's something coming from nature, And finally, there's social unrest occurring. And this is one of the results of this whole period as well. Many people in many countries, we've seen it in North Africa, we've seen it all over the world, people feel that things are not working. Even in Europe, part of the reason for the reaction at the election we had the other day is this feeling of frustration among many people, particularly the young people, that there's something radically wrong with the system as it is. There's good news and bad news. One of the pieces of good news, which I'll mention, is that there is a shift occurring in terms of what we could call a paradigm shift. The way we think about the world. We see a paradigm as kind of a worldview, the way we tend to look at the world. And this is something which often we're not very conscious of. It's something which we accept without question from our parents and from the way that the world operates. We say, well, that's just the way things are. And but what is happening, more and more people are saying, well, it doesn't have to be that way. And more and more people are starting to think about the globe, the whole global society, as a single extended family, where all of us are linked together. Particularly this photo from space back in the 1960s created a lot of this idea of that the Earth is a living entity with its own rules, and that all of the people are really in the same boat, in the same very fragile boat, which is floating through a hostile space. And this is what some of people have called the Gaian hypothesis. And that's why I use the word Gaia quite often in my book, to illustrate that this is a new way of thinking about holistically, about that we're all part of one family, instead of thinking about that we have to compete with each other and destroy each other in order to get ahead. But the bad news is that the current structure is making it very, very difficult to create change. The so-called corporatocracy, which is a word which was coined by an American, John Perkins, who wrote a very fascinating book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He worked for years working with the World Bank, as he describes it, bankrupting the developing countries on purpose, because this is the way the system works. The developing countries have been given the role of supplying us in Europe and the US and Japan, the rich countries, with cheap raw materials. That's their job. Plus to take some of our finished industrial products, but they're not intended to develop and become competitors. And so the corporatocracy is a network of these large corporations and their shareholders. And in the United States, in particular, that's where they're based, most of them, they have also, in this 30-year period, gained political control. And that is what is new. Today in the United States, it's almost impossible to get elected to Congress unless you're either independently wealthy or you have very, very wealthy backers. An ordinary person doesn't have much of a chance. And if you don't accept their philosophy, this philosophy of neoliberalism, the chances are, if you try to run for Congress, they're going to put up somebody against you with millions of dollars behind them that is going to outspend you. And the result is that most of the politicians in Congress have been bought up already by the corporatocracy. And therefore, one of the problems I was facing in writing this book was to ask myself, how do we create change? And in particular, when you're up against such a structure as we have with this corporatocracy, one of the conclusions I came to was that it's impossible for civil society to create change by itself. Now, I was working, as I mentioned, 20 years trying to develop good models of sustainable living. Thousands of other NGOs have been trying to do similar things. And it's like, what have we seen as a result of this? Almost nothing. In spite of all the talk about climate change, the CO2 emissions have risen every year since 1992, when we were supposed to reduce them by 7%. Instead, they've increased by about 28%. And so you get very frustrated. And what do you do about it? This next diagram is one way I describe the contemporary world order, how it actually works. And how it actually works is you have this corporatocracy of very rich, wealthy individuals and corporations, primarily American, who control the U.S. Congress, who controls the U.S. administration, including the president, and they have allies in various foreign elites, like Denmark is one of them, and client states like Saudi Arabia and others who are more or less allied with the United States. And below this, we have these institutions like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, NATO, who are all pretty much under the control of this corporatocracy. Ostensibly, these are democratic organizations where people all countries have a say, but in reality, it's dominated, and pretty much nothing happens against the wishes of the United States. You could say it as it really is. And so at the very bottom of this system, we have 7 billion world citizens who don't have very much to say at all about what's going on. So that's the current system. So now that's enough talk about problems. I'm now going to shift over and talk about some solutions. What do we do if we want to make a change in this situation? Well, the first thing I'm saying we have to do is we have to change the economic system. We have to get away from the idea of neoliberal economics and introduce what I call Gaian economics, which takes its starting point in saying that ecology has to come first and economics second. That's almost obvious when we're threatened as we are at this time by the climate and by the overshoot of the ecological footprint. But I'm also making the point that we cannot just introduce a new economic system without changing these institutions, because the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, they're all designed more or less to fulfill the needs of the corporatocracy. And so we have to both have a new economic system, and we have to introduce new kinds of institutions to replace these institutions, which have a different starting point, which their starting point is to give priority to survival, really, and how we can create a world which is sustainable. So how do we do that? Well, we have to take back control of our economies. Today, we have very little control over our economies. What happens here in Denmark is to a great extent determined by forces outside of Denmark, including this neoliberal system. What we need is have controls on capital flow, controls on imports. Without these kinds of controls, we're at the mercy of the interest of foreigners. For example, on the question of imports, I mentioned, I think briefly before, that we can't compete with these large multinational corporations because of the way that they are able to produce much cheaply and ignore environmental costs and so forth. But if we could put a tariff, for example, on products which were coming into Denmark and which had a lower standard of environmental protection, that could even the playing field. Then we could protect our domestic companies and let them compete on a fair basis. So why don't we do it? Well, the answer is the WTO does not allow it. The WTO was also written by these same people back in 1995. And one of the rules in the WTO is that no member country can put tariffs on a foreign product just because it's produced with low environmental standards. You almost have to show that the product is causing deaths in your country in order to keep it out. It's that bad. And this is the way the system was designed from the beginning. The other problem is the capital flow. And once again, here, if we don't have control over what investments are coming into our country and what money is allowed to flow out of the country, again, we don't have really much control over what's happening. Let's say, for example, Denmark decide, well, we want to give high priority to the concept that localization and decentralization is the best way to go. So we say there's too much power given to the large concentrations of capital. We want to give more power to local communities and local businesses. Then the problem is that then Walmart comes and says they want to buy a Dansk supermarket or maybe Co-op and introduce their concept into Denmark. Today there's nothing we can do really to stop that. And suddenly we would find that the whole idea of creating a sustainable Denmark based on decentralization and more power to local communities is being completely destroyed because we have no way of keeping out that capital that we don't want. Besides which, they also are extracting the profits and sending them offshore somewhere to some tax haven, probably. So what I'm saying here is the only way we can take back control, the only way we can establish a sustainable future, in my opinion, is we have to reform both the EU, which demands that we we have free capital flow. I don't know if you all realize that, but it's written right into the treaty, the EU treaty. There's a certain logic in having free capital flow within the EU because we're, after all, a free trade zone. But what about outside the EU? It seems to me completely illogical and unreasonable that the EU insists that Denmark, for example, has to accept a free flow of capital coming from outside the EU. In the IMF statutes, Article 6, it states directly that every member state has the right to introduce capital controls. And thus, this is the standard from the Second World War until roughly 1980. It's not as if it's something new. It was used, and then this period was actually a period of one of the greatest periods of growth in international trade. And so, as a matter of fact, some of the leading economists in the world, including Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, have pointed out that there's absolutely no evidence that having free capital flow benefits anyone except international speculators who want to be able to get their money out fast, as they did in Southeast Asia in 1997, 1998, and destroyed several economies in the process. If we cannot reform the EU as regards capital flow and the WTO as regards the ability to put tariffs on low standard products coming in, then we have to ask ourselves, maybe we have to leave the WTO. Maybe we have to consider leaving the EU. So I put a question mark on that. But I don't think there's any way we're going to ever get sustainable unless either these institutions, change occurs in these two organizations, or an exit comes about at some point. So what does my ideal world look like? Well, I have introduced in my book something I call the Gaian League. And I asked myself, how can we possibly create change? And I think the change could occur if a few small countries, or even one country, was to reject the neoliberal economics and say, we're going to do things differently. We're going to give first priority to sustainability. We're going to protect our domestic countries against unfair foreign competitions. We're going to be protectionist in a positive way. We're going to protect the environment. We're going to protect our culture. And we're going to give our domestic companies the chance to compete on a fair, level playing field. So my ideal world is saying the following, that the areas where we have to cooperate internationally are really two. One is sustainability, because we can only solve these global problems if we work together internationally. And the other is to do it in such a way which respects human rights. Because we could actually have a sustainable future which was very totalitarian, but I don't think we want to go that direction. So my idea was that we could perhaps have a small number of countries form such a Gaian League as a prototype, as a small group who has these priorities. And these two areas only are the areas where you give up sovereignty. Okay, you give up sovereignty on your sustainability directives, just as the EU today, for example, can issue directives also to Denmark and say, you're not keeping your water clean enough, and so on. Fine, that's a good thing. And human rights. So we do it in a way which is acceptable from a human rights perspective. Everything else, in my model at least, is decentralized. So if Denmark was a member of this league, for example, we could decide ourselves what kind of an economy we wanted to have, whether we wanted to have a capitalist economy or a socialist economy or a religious economy, or whether we wanted to put priority on, let's say, food security, producing our own food, not importing food, simply as a protection against the future. Whatever political decisions you might want to make, you could make, as long as you maintain compliance with these two areas. And so what I envisage then is you have, theoretically, if everyone joined, you would have a large number of preferably small nation states who all maintain their own individuality and their own culture, but accepted that they would give up sovereignty in these two areas. And after all, that is the greatest contribution of human beings to this planet is through their culture. It's the diversity of culture in different countries which really is what is essential, is the essence of being human. And a lot of that is being wiped out these days because of this borderless thinking about the larger corporations. So that, in these days, if you travel even to the third world country, every hotel looks the same as every other hotel. Sometimes you don't even know where you are, until you start maybe going to the old part of the city and you find that they still have food markets and that sort of thing. But there's a risk that if we don't take back this control and introduce some kind of protection of our culture, that we're going to be a homogeneous, very boring culture in another 50, 100 years, if we survive that long. So, this is the point where, for some reason, technically, my presentation breaks down. So for the rest of the presentation, you're going to see double on a smaller scale. And so the next question I addressed here is, can we envisage a way in which this might actually happen, given that we have this corporatocracy and this tremendous resistance from the very wealthy? What I introduce is what I call the breakaway strategy. That is that some smaller countries, because none of the large countries are going to do this, but some of the smaller countries, maybe just 6 or 7, could decide to leave the WTO, form a new kind of trade organization based on the principles I've mentioned, capital controls, putting tariffs on non-acceptable products, and form such a Gaian League. Very small scale initially, but the key is then they would invite others to join. Now, if we look back historically on the way large international organizations have evolved, they've always started this way. The League of Nations, the United Nations, the EU, all started with a little group, maybe 5 or 6 countries getting together. That's the way the European Coal and Steel Union started in the 50s. And so you have a small group that says, we're going to do things differently, invite others to join. And this is where another factor comes into play. Oh, we have to do it manually, yeah, okay. I'll get back to the EU in a second. I just want to add an additional point to the strategy. In each of the major industrialized countries, in the European Union and in the United States in particular, there's a large minority, maybe as much as 30% or so, of people which the American sociologist Paul Ray calls the cultural creators. These are people who have this different view, this holistic view about the earth as a living entity and as the entire planet consisting of an extended family. And these people, in my model here then, would think this is a great idea. Even though they're in a minority, they don't have any much political power. But what they could do is go into the streets and demonstrate and say to their leaders, we should join this group. Why are we not a member? In fact, just imagine, even in the United States and in Europe, people taking to the streets in hundreds of thousands and millions and saying to their leaders, let's have a vote, a referendum on whether we shouldn't join. They're doing all the things that our politicians talk about we should be doing, but they never do it. And this is again, that brings me to the EU, because the EU is also a big problem, because the problem with the EU is that they say one thing and they do another. And this is one reason why they've become so unpopular. And what they are saying often is that, well, we think we should be more sustainable. But every time there's a conflict between being more sustainable and having economic growth, it's always economic growth that wins out. So we keep running up higher and higher and up this curve of overshoot on the ecosystem, ecological footprint. If only the EU could shift their priorities and say, we're going to take the lead on this. We're going to actually change our priorities, and we're going to try to create alliances with others who would support this, reject neoliberalism, and say we're going to from now on, focus entirely on survival and making sure that we're going to be sustainable in 40, 50 years. I think a lot of countries would back them up. And I think that if they took the lead, that strategy would work because the EU is so powerful and so respected and has such a powerful currency and everything that even the United States, I don't think, could resist the pressures which would be coming from their own minority. However, it's not likely to happen in the short term, at least. The recent election might possibly create some movement, but even among those who have been very critical about the EU, a lot of them are still giving first priority to economic growth. So I don't see the likelihood that the EU is going to take the lead, although I hope they will. Let's take the next one. Which one is it? Okay. So finally, just a couple of words about Denmark. What about Denmark? Could Denmark take the lead? Could Denmark be part of this small group? I mean, in my book, I actually mentioned about 12 countries which I thought were feasible candidates for such an initiative, and I didn't mention Denmark, primarily because Denmark, as a member of the EU, would not be able to be a part of the Guyan League because of its membership in the EU, which prevents it from introducing these restrictions on flow of capital and flow of goods. So it would have to leave the EU. And that is a very, very difficult and very big decision that I don't think a majority of Danes is ready for. But I did write an article, which is available just outside here. It just was published just a couple of days ago, which might interest some of you, and it deals particularly with this question, which I asked at the beginning of the article: how far can Denmark go to become sustainable on its own? And you could also say, how far could any country go? And my conclusion is that without major reforms in the EU and in the WTO, there's not much chance of becoming sustainable. So I'll come back again to that question about that. Those are the key things which somehow we have to deal with. So I think now it's time to round off, and we're going to have a break.
What about your song?
Yeah, that's the final thing.
Yeah.
I thought that we might just round off before our break, and then we have a discussion afterwards with a little song I wrote, which has the same title as the book, and it's about the what's happening in the corporatocracy and all that. Do you want to start it up? Well, I walked downtown to Zuccotti Park. It was 6 p.m. and getting dark when I saw a young couple chatting and drinking Cokes. I asked them what was going on here, and the young lady answered loud and clear, "We're here to send a message to our folks. This land was once the land of the free, of justice and democracy. Now America's lost her way and got off track. One man, one vote was the order then. Now our land's been stolen by the money men, and all of us here are just trying to get her back. Occupy New York City, occupy Santa Fe, occupy Cincinnati, occupy San Jose. We might be in Salt Lake City or in Washington, D.C., speaking out for human rights and more equality. The young man said his name was Bob, and recently he'd lost his job. His firm had pulled up stakes and moved offshore. They say it's cheaper in Shanghai, where profit rates are record high, and they don't pay much in taxes anymore. The 1%ers cheat and steal and don't produce a thing that's real. Asset speculation is their style. These guys are parasites, he said. They ought to get real jobs instead and make a contribution that's worthwhile. Occupy San Francisco, occupy Wichita, occupy Sacramento, occupy Omaha, occupy Minnesota, occupy Tennessee, standing up for nature and sustainability. I went to Europe to just check out what the Euro fuss was all about. The youth are without jobs, and that's the key. The young folks want their countries back, but leaders take a different tack. Bank bailouts and more austerity. The euro was a big mistake, a backdoor to a euro state that citizens would rather be without. The people want a deal that's fair, where bankers pay their rightful share. Until that day, they'll roam the streets and shout, Occupy Copenhagen, occupy Birmingham, occupy Londonderry, occupy Amsterdam. We are camping out in Athens as we make a final plea. We'd rather leave the euro than have more austerity. We will occupy Milano, occupy Luxembourg, occupy Barcelona, occupy this whole world. Now our numbers, they are growing, and we won't accept defeat. Time to end injustice, time to occupy World Street. Time to end injustice. Time to occupy World Street. I was lucky that those students came by just at the right time when we were downtown. Okay, we take a little break now. Yeah. What's the plan for the break? 15 minutes or so?
Yeah. Okay. So if anybody has some questions, please take the microphone.
Or comments.
Comments.
Yeah.
It was about the Gaia League you talked about. I think it was a very interesting and a creative idea. And we were just discussing here in the break whether it might be able to grow by itself, more or less. If you understand what I mean. Not necessarily the states were the initiatives takers, but maybe if members started from the bottom up, or from different countries, they could initiate this Gaia League, maybe just like that.
So Gaia movement.
Yeah.
Well, that was more or less the idea, that initially you might just have 6 or 7 small states, and that gradually the others would join. That's the model that I'm suggesting.
But I was just saying that if the states were not interested, maybe ordinary people could just join together and say, let's start it.
I don't know about that. But they could put pressure on their governments, I think.
Perhaps, yeah.
But I have difficulty seeing what they could do on their own otherwise. But I think that also another possibility is that some states might decide to have a sort of an associated status, where they come in as observers in a transition period, and just sort of see how it's working, and then become perhaps full members later. And that's the way I think it would happen in practice.
That might lead to the next question, because, well, it's actually a follow-up on what she said, but I'm very curious and very interested in these small ecosystems that grow, that are, going, what are you saying, are getting popular around the world.
Eco-villages?
Yeah, eco-villages. And I think it's I really agree on everything what you say, but I can't imagine that a whole country would ever start doing something like that. I mean, it will take immense collaborations and common ideas about how things will be in the future. So for me, I also see it that it has to start in the very small, like communities like that, and then that might show the world that okay, they can do it. So this is an example, and that probably take around 50 years, and then we can start. I don't know what's your perspective on this, if there is even one. How fast would it go, or can we start in this? Or should we start in the small, or is there somehow we can?
Well, the movement has been in existence now for a little over 24 years since we really started it, and I would say the movement has been rather slow. And it's true, as you say, that it's difficult to imagine that an entire country could decide just to live like eco-villagers. But what I think could happen is that they could be role models for others. If we get a real big crisis, like with the peak oil or with a major catastrophe, another financial crisis or whatever, then people will always look around and say, what do we do now? And these may be places where people could move to rebuild, or at the least they could have an alternative model, because now we have a lot of experience in how you organize these smaller communities. We have our Gaia Education has produced a number of books, so that you could very quickly get up to speed as to what you need to do if you want to form such a community and so on. Also, I had a talk recently with an American who is working with cities around the world. He was saying an interesting thing was that, in his opinion, he thinks the major change, if it ever does come, is not going to come from the top, from the governments, federal governments, but from the cities working together, because they're faced with the actual problem. For example, he mentioned that in places like San Francisco, they can do their math on the back of an envelope, and they can say that if the climate does change, they're going to be have to make a decision on whether they're going to start building dikes or whether they're going to move people inland or what. And no matter what the federal government does, many cities are talking about how do we become resilient. And so if enough cities follow that pattern, then it may be that the change will occur sort of without us really noticing it. And his idea also was that the things that we're doing in the eco-village movement are in many ways very similar. But what the problem is, he says, the people who are working at the city level don't know about it, and they don't have the same language either. And so his idea was that we should be working closer together so that we could exchange experiences. But it's an interesting model, I think, that the cities. He was even saying that in a major breakdown, we might have to go back to the idea of city-states, just as we had, in the Middle Ages and earlier, rather than nation-states. Because if things really start to get bad, really start to break down, and we're losing our communication, and the internet's down, and the energy is down, then we may have to sort of gather around existing communities and rebuild from there.
Is Gaia League working together with any like Findhorn or Damhorn or Arrowville or New Earth Nation, or any one of those? We are. I'm personally engaged with all of these because they're part of the Eco-Village network. Yeah. And the head of Gaia Education is also, or was until recently, based in Findhorn also, and our formally speaking, the organization is a non-profit, which is based in Scotland and headquartered in Findhorn. So, yeah, I'm familiar with all of these, Damanhur and Findhorn and Solheimer and many others. Yeah. But that's not really the same as, well, maybe what you were thinking. They are part of a network, and they know each other, and they're exchanging information all the time. We had a big meeting in Switzerland this summer, last summer, with, I think, 350 people, mostly from Europe, but also from other countries who got together. They have an annual meeting with all the eco-villages around the world. And that was very encouraging. Particularly the youth. There were many young people who were very keen on the idea, which is good. So we've now formed a youth group called Next Gen. So they're very active.
I have a question about the ways to go from one system to another system. People, I heard a lot of talking about the evolution of capitalism. What's the next? And I hate revolutions. I come from Soviet Union, so I'm immune revolutions. But the evolution, how do we make this transformation from one system to another? It could be a possibility to go through these big corporations, which we have also maybe a bit smaller corporations in Denmark here, and I guess there's a lot of visionary top managers, corporate managers, that could lead that kind of change, because I don't think we can do it, do this kind of transfer only politically, because there's still a very big money here. So do you think it's possible to kind of make a little club with corporate top managers understanding the visionary people?
I think it's actually happening already, but the numbers are small. But there are some business leaders who I think have realized the need to change the way they run their companies. But there's still a small minority. But so I think that the change may come in an evolutionary way. That you have a lot of these NGOs that are working for change, and you have the eco-village people that are doing it on the ground, and you have the transition town people who are doing it in small villages, and you have the bigger cities who are concerned about climate change, and then you have the business community. And I think that the most likely scenario is that they will gradually sort of accept the fact that we have to make gradual change, and hopefully without a breakdown, a total breakdown. That's the big question I have: is that can we do it quickly enough to avoid that? And it's really hard to say if that's going to be possible, because what are we going to use for energy, in another 40 years from now? Can we really convert to renewable energy in time? Nobody really knows. And can we stop burning all the fossil fuels that are in the ground today? That's going to be difficult too. Yeah.
Thank
you. The title of this talk is Occupy Wall Street. To me, Occupy is a term that has certain connotations as revolution, war, military occupation, and so on. But this can't be the case for you. So how do you define contemporary meaning of the word occupy, or a civil?
Yeah. Well, if we look historically at the Occupy movement, it has not been violent at all in any way. They have had peaceful demonstrations, and their main message was to point out the inequalities in society, and that these were causing major issues, unrest, and were unfair, and so forth. So I don't think necessarily it's fair to associate the word occupy with militarism or violence, because that's not their tradition in that movement at all. But I can see where you're coming from, because in other situations you might think of it more as a more aggressive idea. But it was more of a type of demonstration than anything else. By occupying a park, say, that was basically the first thing they did in Zuccotti Park in New York, just to bring attention to themselves and the issues. but they kind of died out in the meantime. We don't hear much about them anymore. And yet the basic ideas are still relevant. Most recently, we have this very well-known book by the French economist Piketty, who's pointed out that through time, there's a tendency for capital to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands, unless we actively do something to prevent it. And this is very much the same message as the Occupy people had.
Any other questions?
It's a bit related to like the question about the change coming from the corporations, and maybe it's a bit sidetracked, but I'm interested in like your own transition or development from being like a successful businessman into being an NGO and concerned with forming networks like the Gen and the Gen Corp. If you want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because it's related, like, how do we get these top management also to kind of open up their eyes, I think. And the problem about corporations, as I see it, is not like a single man sitting and running it. It's like a big network of agents in a way. Like, so it's not like that you just have to convince one of them. It's like more like a big complicated entities, each one of them.
Yeah. Well, my personal journey probably isn't something which I could recommend just to anybody to try the same, but because every person has their own individual path. But I had a very powerful spiritual experience back in 1982, and I actually wrote a book about this. That there was one of the people around here who said he'd read it, actually. When was that? You, yeah. Called the Kali Yuga Odyssey, and my spiritual journey, and that was very much what changed my way of thinking, from just thinking in terms of a standard businessman to realizing this idea of the Gaia as the living world and the living planet, and that I should be contributing somehow to this evolution. And I think there are many people at this time around the world who feel the same way, that working together to create this transition. And so I decided that perhaps the best way that I could personally contribute to that was to use my abilities and my background in a positive way. And that's why I formed this hedge fund, which was owned by Gaia Trust, to create the money to be able to use it to support various sustainability projects around the world. So I don't say everyone has to have a spiritual impulse, and there's probably only a few people that would, in practice, have that. But
it would help.
It certainly helps a lot, because it gives you a different perspective on things. And you realize that, at least I realize that we come back again, time and time again to this in the physical world, and this is only a very small part of our total personality and our total life journey. And therefore, it's important that we take care of things, because we're going to be coming back, suffering the consequences if we don't treat the planet well. And that gives a different perspective on things, I think. Yeah.
Was there any catalyst for like you searching out that spiritual teachings, or?
Actually, no. It actually happened very sort of accidentally. I was just visiting an ashram in India. It just happened to be the right energy to trigger me somehow. Yeah.
And what kind of work does this is a different question. What kind of work does the Gen actually do? Is it more like advisory work or management work for?
No, Gen is a network of eco-villages, and both I mentioned as intentional communities that have been in the West and traditional villages in the South, who simply are exchanging information and learning from each other, and gradually, teaching. Most of the larger ones, like Findhorn and Damanhur, and also some here in Denmark, like Hallinge Lille in Sjælland, and Hjortshøj, a lot of them are teaching in their regions also how to live sustainably, and so they have a great outreach, most of them. This is quite different from the origins back in the 70s, when a lot of the intentional communities in the States were sort of rejecting society and isolating themselves out in the country somewhere. And that is also the image that most politicians still have today. If you mention the word eco-village to a Danish politician, if they've ever heard of the word before, they will probably automatically think, oh yeah, 1970, the farm in the US, that sort of thing. But the reality today is, in Denmark particularly, because Denmark is where it all started really, with co-housing back in the late 60s, and 3 eco-villages in the early 90s. There's been a major shift where today a lot of municipalities actually are encouraging people to come and build the eco-villages. Roskilde is a good example of that, where they have several, and that's because they've discovered that these are good tax-paying citizens with jobs, and they're contributing new activities to their communities and so on. And so they've really shifted the image quite a bit from what it used to be. And as I say, a lot of them are teaching centers now, with outreach to their local regions. That's the picture now, and it's going to continue slowly to expand, I think. And we're also working closely in Gen with Transition Town movement, which you've probably heard of also, which works more at the sort of the village level. And we work very closely with them. One of the problems with the transition movement is often that they don't have the same content, and their educational aspects are very limited. I think they have a 1 or 2 day course where in Guy Education we have a 4-week course, so it's much more intensive. So we work together now to bring education into their programs.
A few more questions.
I think one of the very difficult things about this capitalism is that it's so good at sucking nutrition from whatever comes around, even if it's resistance of different kinds, or underground movements, or whatever. So of course it's nice that with this hedge fund you've been able to take some out the other way somehow, but maybe even still when doing that, there's also some nutrition brought into capitalism at the same time, or there's always something happening there also when we do something somewhere else. Also when the Occupy movement is on the streets, there's it sets wheels in motions in the just if you would have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, one of the things I mentioned in my book is that capitalism is not really a very well-defined concept, and there are different forms of capitalism, and there's an Indian and a Chinese and an American and a European and many others, and so I don't like to sort of use the word capitalism as a general term, because it means different things to different people. I think the idea of having a marketplace is a quite okay idea, because it does enable us to be more efficient. But the problem with the dominant form of capitalism in our era is that the prices do not represent the real costs. I mean, there should be a charge on companies' products which are abusing the environment, for example, or damaging the oceans and so forth. But we've never found a way to do that in practice. It's a very complex problem. So I guess the hope is eventually that we will perhaps define a new kind of capitalism that is somehow more socially responsible. And there are some interesting trends in that direction. I was just talking to my auditor today, who was saying there's a new law that has been passed for the first time this year, that every corporation has to make some statement as to what it's doing about human rights and the environment. What policies does the company have, if any? That's interesting. I didn't know about that. But just the very fact that the company has to make some statement about that is going to make a lot of top managers begin to think, well, I don't want to write that we have no interest whatsoever. You know, that wouldn't look good. And so actually that's a very subtle way of sort of nudging them. You know, in the original American capitalism back in the latter part of the 18th century, after the American Revolution, it's interesting that the corporations at that time had a charter, a state charter. And in that charter, the states would say that the purpose of the corporation is to have a social objective. And if the corporation did not live up to its social responsibilities, it could be dissolved. And there were corporations that were dissolved at that time. And that's a situation I think would be good if we could come back to that. And but what happened in the States was that gradually that disappeared. You know, until today we're almost at the opposite extreme, where there's almost no social responsibility except for, well, you mentioned there's a few companies and a few leaders that are, but they're the exception these days. And if the head of a big company announces that he's going to be more socially responsible, the chances are he'll be replaced by someone else, because it's going to cost them on the bottom line. And that's the situation we're facing today. How do we make a shift there? Yeah.
Are you in contact with any people from the government?
In Denmark?
Yeah, or other countries? Are there some from the government who are interested in your ideas? Or
Yeah, I had an interesting visit last year to Tunisia, where I spoke with the president. He invited me to come down. He'd heard about my book. We had a personal talk, and I presented my ideas to a large group of from the business and university milieu.
Where?
In Tunisia. And they were one of the countries on my list, actually. And because I felt that they had the kind of profile that might just be interested in this. And this was after the revolution that I wrote my book, you know. So he actually said that he thought the idea of having a dialogue with other countries would be a good idea. And he would even host it, he said. But then what happened was they had a political crisis. I don't know if any of you have followed what's been happening down in Tunisia, but they had total chaos almost, and just like similar to Egypt, not quite as bad. And they've had big crises with the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. And his party is very small. It's like the SF was in the Danish coalition. It's the smallest of three parties, okay. And so he doesn't have a lot of influence. And they kept postponing the next election, and so there hasn't been much possibility of following up on that. But that's the only case I've had where I've had a direct contact.
okay, no one from Scandinavia.
Not at the government level, no. But we do have contacts at a lower level where people are talking to some of the governments. We had a very good contact in Iceland for a while, and we were hoping that might be an interesting country to join the Gaian League. But then they've shifted governments now in Iceland, and they're more or less gliding back into the same kind of system that they had before the big breakdown in 2008. So right now it doesn't look optimistic in Iceland. Norway also is an interesting possibility where we've had some contacts, but the feedback I'm getting on Norway is that they're very, very conservative. Even with the social democratic government under Stoltenberg, they were saying that they were very, very conservative, similar to social democrats in Denmark, who basically have accepted the neoliberalism as a kind of a given that you can't modify. And that's a little unfortunate. So in speaking realistically, we're probably not going to have any real movement in this idea until we have some kind of a major crisis again. And then my hope is that at some point, if things really get into a crisis atmosphere, that maybe the idea might surface again, and some people might say, well, maybe we should try something different. And that was also the logic behind starting the EcoVillage movement, was that eventually we foresaw back in the late 80s that eventually there's going to be a breakdown. Because I was very influenced by the Limits to Growth study back in the 1972, which projected a crisis in the mid-21st century. And it still looks like their analysis is very much in line with actual developments, in spite of the fact that many people have claimed that the projections were all wrong. They're actually not. They're right on what they said back in 72.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's also. Yeah.
Just a little question. Do you feel that your thoughts and your program can in any way fit some of the bigger or smaller political parties in Denmark, for example?
Well, it's good that you ask, because I have been one of the founding members of the new party called the Alternativet, and have contributed to their program, which has just been adopted last Sunday in Aarhus, and will be presented at Bornholm at the Folkemødet in next month. And I had a lot of input, particularly on the economic strategies and reforms. So I think that this party, I think, is very much in line with my thinking. In fact, Uffe Elbæk, he contacted me last summer, and I don't know if any of you noticed, but he actually mentioned in an article in one of the newspapers that one of the best books he'd read last summer was mine, and he invited me to a discussion before he left the Radical Party about his ideas, and he was very inspired by my book. So I'm hoping that the Alternative Party could be, a breakthrough that moves in this direction. But it's very early days yet, because until last week we didn't have a program. And we've been more or less ignored by the popular press until now. So it'll be interesting to see how they react after Bornholm, if we get a little bit more coverage.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, last question.
I would like to ask a somewhat maybe more philosophical question that has somewhat to do with my own difficulties with defining the word sustainability and working with it. And also it has a little to do with this, what you talked about with capitalism, buying in on a lot of sort of good ideas, where if you ask people at conferences or so, how do they define sustainability, you get a really broad array of answers, and that can maybe be really good. But I would at least say there are also some things that sustainability cannot be, at least from my point of view. We cannot solve the economic crisis and the ecological crisis at the same time. There needs to be some things we say no to also. Today, ecology and sustainability is almost also used as very good words, and everyone wants it. But it's more hard to sell this. Well, there's some things you cannot do. You cannot have 20 kinds of ecologic bread at your bakery. It's simply not a very good way of making bread. You need to have fewer choices, or we need to also limit our level of living standard in some way, or at least changing them a lot. And to me that's very challenging to communicate also.
It is.
And I think it's also this challenge of saying, if we want to avoid totalitarianism, it's to see some strength in diversity in ideas, that sustainability should be, in a way, allowed to be defined in many ways, and at the same time saying, no, there are some things it cannot be, and if we want to have a strong movement, we also need to have a strong concept of what sustainability can be. So this was just to explain some of my difficulties with the word, and maybe you would have some comments on it.
Yeah, well, there is a field of economics called ecological economics, where I think they have made a lot of effort in defining what they mean by sustainability. They have a so-called strong and weak definitions, but I think the strong definition is basically that that to be sustainable in the long run, we mustn't take more out of the earth than we give back. That's the basic idea. So whatever else we do, whatever methods of production or economics we have, that has to be the bottom line in the long run. And that's why I think we have to consider ecology as being above and more important than economics. And this idea that we have to focus on more jobs, I think is totally wrong in that perspective. Instead, we should be asking ourselves, what is a reasonable level of production, given the fact that we have to be sustainable, and then decide how do we share the work, because we can probably produce as much as we actually need for basic living with much less than full employment. And so the big issue I think we're going to be facing in the coming decades, I think, is going to be, what do we do with that problem? Are we going to share the work? Are we going to have a shorter work week? Or are we going to have some kind of a guaranteed annual income for everyone? I mean, these are the kind of issues we ought to be talking about. But it's very difficult to have a discussion about that, because the politicians can't think further than next year and creating new jobs, without even thinking about the fact that we're already using in Denmark, for example, about 4 times our share of the ecological allocation, which is about 2 hectares per person. We're using about 8. We're actually about I think the 3rd worst in the world right now. We even are worse than the USA. Although 5 years ago they were the leaders. Now it's only, I think, Qatar and maybe Saudi Arabia who are worse than Denmark. But it's not easy, I agree. But I think we have to somehow get that thought into our heads. And that, the Chinese, they have speaking philosophy, the Chinese have an expression, I think, that says that a rich man is one who knows that he has enough. And I mean, what would it be a disaster if we had to set our standard of living back to the way it was, say, in 1980 or 1970? We still had a good life at that time. And we don't have to always be getting more and more and more in order to have a good life. Maybe we should be focusing more on having more free time and more time with our families and with our hobbies and in nature. I think in future generations they're going to be thinking much along those terms, instead of thinking about getting more and more stuff all the time. But it's a big shift in consciousness. Yeah.
I think this is a good place to end.
Okay.
Ross, yeah.
Fine.
Thank you very much, Ross.
My
it has
pleasure.
been really a big pleasure to have you here and a great presentation. Let's give him a big hand.